Order. I am going to read our, well, first of all, I'll say I'm hosting today's meeting from a treehouse in honor of the topic of today's meeting, which is in our community courtyard. And it's also a way to keep my kids from snacking on my snacks during meeting time. So welcome to the treehouse. And I will open with our standard COVID greeting. That in keeping with the Oregon Public Meetings Law, statutory land use hearing requirements, and Title 33 of the Portland City Code, the Portland Planning and Sustainability Commission is holding this meeting virtually. All members of the PSC are attending remotely, and the city has made several avenues available for the public to watch the broadcast of this meeting. The PSC is taking these steps as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to limit in-person contact and promote social distancing. The pandemic is an emergency that threatens the public health, safety, and welfare, which requires us to meet remotely by electronic communications. Thank you all for your patience, humor, flexibility, and understanding as we manage through this difficult situation to do the city's business. And now we'll go to items of interest from commissioners. Are there any? Please raise your virtual hand. I have one item of interest, which is we have an opportunity, as mentioned at the last meeting, to appoint a commissioner to serve on the Airport Advisory Committee, which meets quarterly. And I've heard a recommendation or interest from Oriana to serve in that role. And I want to see if anyone else has interest in that role. Want to raise your hands now? Okay, would someone like to make a nomination?
I would be delighted to make that nomination.
Thank you, Steph. A second?
Second.
Second from Mike, thank you. And let's do a vote. Julie.
Sorry, I was not ready for this.
Sorry about that.
And I don't know, let's see. And Jeff is not here yet, correct? Okay, so Bordalazzo.
Yes, and happy to pass the baton since I'm the former liaison with that committee, and look forward for Rihanna to be part of that. I think she'll have a lot to add.
Hauk.
Ben, is Erwin Bergman still on that committee?
Sorry, as I was muting, the audio was overriding. Can you repeat that, please?
Erwin Bergman, is he still on that committee?
He is. He is. Very vocal.
He's been there 20 or 30 years.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Larcel.
Yes, yes.
And oddly enough, I don't see Oriana on here yet.
She has just asked me to forward her Zoom link. Is there someone who could assist with that?
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you, Julie.
Okay. Ralph.
Ben, thank you so much for your service. Aye.
Schultz.
Aye.
Smith.
Yes.
Spivak.
Yes, and I hope that maybe Ben, you and Oriana can connect sometime offline just to make sure she's up to speed on what's been going on there so far.
Can I just say very quickly, this is her not being here. I became president of my academic fraternity in college once because I overslept. So I hope that this is not a repeat.
She told me just half an hour ago that she is game to serve, and she is trying to log in right now. So we'll save that for you, Steph, next time. Okay. Any other items of interest? Not hearing any. Let's go to the director's report. Director Durbin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you. I wanted to give an update. First of all, just as an acknowledgement and appreciation. As you all know, the City Council passed residential infill, and really want to appreciate all of you. Planning Sustainability Commission did an enormous amount of work on that policy development, heard a lot of testimony. City Council is very appreciative to you all for your work. So thank you for that. And I wanted just to recap the changes or the amendment package so that the commissioners are aware. So as you know, the council passed it on August 12th with a 3-to-1 vote. They kept the package largely as you had proposed, allowing 4 units on most single dwelling lots with a visitability requirement. and they passed 6 amendments. Most of those amendments were technical in nature, but there are 3 that I'll highlight. One was allowing duplex on all lots. This was to conform with House Bill 2001. The second was allowing 6 plexes in half the units that are affordable at 80% MFI and 1.2 FAR. The third was further encourage the preservation of existing housing by restricting the number of dwelling units on a site to 2 if a historic resource has been demolished. So this was an interim measure under the until the Historic Resource Code Amendment project is passed. So residential info will be effective on August 1st, 2021, and this package brings us into compliance with Senate Bill 534. It brings us in mostly compliance with House Bill 2001, but as you know, we will have further work that we need to do covering cottage clusters, R10, R20, and RF zones. So once at some point here in the coming weeks, we will shift to that work, and you will be seeing a future package. But again, really want to appreciate Planning Sustainability Commission for the heavy lifting that you all did on that. And then my second update is really to let everyone know that we will, in September, start recruitment for open positions on the Planning Sustainability Commission, our youth position, and also anticipated opening positions. So we'll start that process in September. And when that announcement is ready to go, we'll share that with all of you. We'll really look to you to help reach out to your networks, encourage your peers and colleagues to consider serving, and help promote serving on this commission. So we will have more information for you on that in the coming weeks, but just anticipate that to start sometime in mid-September.
Thank you so much, Angie. And I want to make a big call out for staff on the RIP project. Joe and Sandra and Morgan got a lot of gray hairs going back 5-6 years. And we have to celebrate when things get completed through this stage of the process, but also acknowledge that it's not done yet. They're not going to be able to just go into the sunset on this because RIP is not implemented yet. There's still the appeal period. And so I'm looking forward to it being available on the ground. So thank you. We're now going to switch over to the consent agenda. Would someone like to make a motion for the minutes from our last meeting to adopt them?
I move that we adopt the minutes.
Second.
Sorry,
Okay. Motion from Katie and a second from Chris. All in favor, practice raising your virtual hand. I'm counting them. Kat, Steph, Chris, Mike, Jeff, Ben, Oriana, who's on now. And I see your real hand, Katie. So that passes unanimously. Minutes are adopted. And with that, I'm going to invite Emily and any staff you'd like to bring to come to the front here into the treehouse and share the update on a briefing on the tree code project.
I just have to quickly say, Eli, your background is perfect for this briefing.
Thank you.
I also positioned myself in front of a window with a tree view. I'm not outside though. Thanks, Eli. My name is Emily Sandy, Code and Policy Analyst with the Bureau of Development Services. I am going to attempt to share my screen here. This is only the second time I've done this, so bear with me. Okay. So, we're here to brief you on the proposal for amendments to Chapter 1150, Trees and Development Situations. Development Services is the lead on this project since it deals with regulations of Title 11 that pertain to development situations. However, we've worked collaboratively as a team with Portland Parks and Rec Urban Forestry Division and BPS. So I'll be giving a roughly 20-minute presentation followed by opportunity for you to ask questions and have discussion. If you can, hold off on questions until the end or document them in the chat so we can get back to them. And I want to acknowledge the core team members who've been working on this proposal and will be available to help answer questions after the presentation. So from BPS, Sally Edmonds, Jeff Cottle, Steve Kuntz, and Tom Armstrong. From Urban Forestry, Nick Desai and Brian Lando. And also from BDS, Kimberly Talent. Oops. So a little background, you'll recall last fall, we came to you with a proposal on extending a sunset date for required preservation and inch per inch fee in lieu of preservation for trees 36 inches DBH or greater to allow for additional work and evaluation of that provision. Planning and Sustainability Commission and Urban Forestry Commission supported that extension, but also made additional recommendations relating to the removal of exemptions for tree preservation and tree density in central employment, central commercial, general industrial 1, and heavy industrial zones. And then the Urban Forestry Commission also made a recommendation to reduce that key threshold, which I'll talk about in a minute, from 36 inches to 20 inches. Council ended up passing the sunset date extension of the existing regulations through 2024. However, acknowledging that we needed to do further notice engagement and address some legal considerations of the additional recommendations, instead of acting on them, Council passed a resolution directing additional work, and this project is the outcome of that resolution. The same resolution also directed Urban Forestry to lead development of a scope of work to be brought to City Council by the end of this calendar year for a broader Title 11 project. That project could include technical amendments, amendments related to non-development situations, street trees, or development situation regulations. Before getting to the analysis and proposal, just some background on the relevant regulations. For tree preservation of private trees in development situations, the code currently requires that at least 1/3 of healthy, otherwise not exempt trees 12 inches or greater must be preserved, or a fee must be paid to mitigate for the loss of the tree. The fee for trees 12 to 20 inches and 20 to 36 inches is tiered, and those fees are currently valued at $1,800 and $3,600 respectively. The code also requires that all trees with diameter of 36 inches or larger must be preserved or a fee paid in lieu. And the fee paid is based on a different calculation called an inch per inch fee calculation. The amount of fee increases for every inch of the diameter of the tree. The fee is currently $450 an inch. So starting at a 36 inch tree, that fee is currently $16,200 and up. Trees located in EX, CX, IG1, and IH zones are exempt from tree preservation requirements. For tree density, the code requires a certain baseline number of trees on a site. And the calculation for how many trees is a function of the site size and the use of the property, with residential uses requiring the highest level of density and industrial uses the lowest. Tree density can be met by preserving or planting trees or paying a fee in lieu. And the fee in lieu is based on planting 1.5 inch medium canopy tree, and that fee is currently $675 per tree. Similarly, sites in EX, CX, IG1, and IH are exempt from tree density requirements. I want to note that there are other exemptions from both tree preservation and tree density, and this project doesn't deal with those. So mitigation fees paid in lieu of preservation or planting go to the city's tree planting and preservation fund. The fund can be used for tree planting as well as preserving trees through easement or property acquisition. The use of the fund is guided by the citywide tree planting strategy called Growing a More Equitable Urban Forest, which was developed in 2018 to increase tree canopy throughout the city, particularly in areas where it's needed most. The strategy prioritizes tree planting in neighborhoods that are both low income and low canopy. Industrial zones are not an identified priority area, largely because the strategy focuses the limited amount of funds available to areas where underserved communities live, and housing is not allowed in industrial zones, though it may be adjacent to industrial zones. This map shows the location of the zones currently exempt from tree preservation and density requirements. The pink areas show the IH zone. Purple, yellow, and red indicate IG1, CX, and EX, respectively. As you can see, the exemptions proposed to be removed are primarily in the Central City and Gateway and the Brooklyn Rail Yard area, while the areas where the exemptions are not proposed to be removed include the north reach of the Willamette and the western portions of the Columbia Corridor. As you know, as urban infrastructure, trees play a vital role in our environment and the health of our communities. And just some of the services they provide are listed here. Structural value estimates replacement of the tree and a partial approximation of the services lost when a tree is removed. This table illustrates the annual structural value of a broadleaf deciduous tree in 3 different size categories and in residential and industrial areas. Reducing the size threshold for inch per inch mitigation from 36 to 20 inches brings the cost of mitigation closer to the structural value of the tree on an annual basis, but it doesn't match the investment retained by the preservation of the tree over time because it's a one-time fee. A major parameter of our analysis includes maintaining compliance with statewide Planning Goal 9, economic development. Goal 9 requires local governments to demonstrate that there's an adequate inventory of developable industrial and employment land to accommodate forecasted economic growth over a short term and over a 20-year horizon. The supply is analyzed in a state mandated economic opportunities analysis, which is performed by BPS. I'll refer to that as an EOA. The city's last EOA was most recently updated as part of the 2035 comp plan adopted in 2016. The EOA estimates the 20-year supply and demand for employment land in the city by geography and land use types, and uses a buildable land inventory, or BLI, that identifies specific properties that are most likely to redevelop over the 20-year period. Once the 20-year land supply is identified, local governments must monitor the availability of that supply to ensure that the projected demand can still be met. If the land supply is reduced to a level below the 20-year demand projected in the EOA, the local government then moves out of compliance with Goal 9. To estimate the supply of land available, development constraints are incorporated into the analysis. Development constraints can be those that reduce the physical land available for development, on a 1-to-1 ratio, such as steep slopes or wetlands. They may also be regulatory constraints like environmental overlay zones or floodplains. They may also be financial constraints that may affect the market in a way that reduces the probability that land would be developed. Examples of this include the cost of brownfield cleanup or the cost to provide adequate public sewer, water, or other infrastructure to a site. This project essentially conducted a discrete EOA-like analysis using the land supply adopted in 2016 and the effect of other subsequent code amendments since then as a baseline for the land supply. The analysis then factored in the additional cost of the potential tree code changes as development constraints. The first analysis was a tree canopy analysis to estimate the frequency of trees and different tree size categories. To estimate the diameters of trees located on industrially zoned lands currently exempt from the regulations, an environmental consulting firm, SWCA, was hired to complete a GIS analysis. SWCA staff also used existing Portland Parks and Rec tree inventories and site visits to industrial sites to calibrate the model to achieve an acceptable statistical significance. For all the other zones, staff reviewed the past 2 years worth of development permits to estimate the composition of trees. Using the outcomes of the tree canopy analysis, Johnson Economics then completed an economic analysis to assess the potential impacts of the proposals on the availability of industrial lands required by Goal 9. They estimated the impact of the removal of tree preservation and tree density exemptions, as well as reducing that preservation threshold from 36 to 20 inches for the 4 currently exempt zones. They also estimated the impact of reducing the preservation threshold to 20 inches for all other areas of the city where preservation is already required, primarily to quantify the effect on housing production and cost. The analysis focused on lands with tree canopy defined as vacant or underutilized in the existing buildable lands inventory. Portions of sites already in environmental overlay zones were excluded. While the tree code regulations can be physical or cost-related development constraints, depending on how an applicant chooses to meet the requirements, for purposes of this analysis, we assume that fees in lieu of preservation or planting would be paid. This was primarily due to the difficulty of estimating the physical land area impacts, giving the variety of differing site conditions, numbers of trees, conditions of trees, and development needs on individual sites. There was also uncertainty estimating the choices that applicants would make to meet those requirements. Areas within the current BLI that have tree canopy were analyzed to narrow in on the areas that would be affected by the changes. For the 4 exempt zones specifically, the acreage of these areas is reflected in the 3rd column titled Acres with Canopy. IH zone has 59, of the area analyzed, IH zone has 59% of the total acreage of the 4 zones. And 60% of the tree canopy acreage in those zones at 56 acres. In total, 94 acres were analyzed in the 4 exempt zones. They're not shown here. Note that there are an additional 137 acres of tree canopy on private property in IH that is not currently in the BLI or within an environmental overlay zone. And at this time, land containing this tree canopy is not expected to be developed over the next 20 years. The analysis determined that removing the exemptions for tree preservation and density in IH would be expected to result in a reduction of the amount of industrial land available for development over the next 20 years to a level below the state mandated minimum. The current capacity in the combined harbor access lands and harbor airport districts is 10 acres. Modeling estimated a reduction of 11.8 acres from the removal of the IH tree preservation exemption and an additional 11.9 acres due to removal of the IH tree density exemption for a combined reduction of 23.7 acres in IH. In IG1, CX, and EX was determined that there would be some impact on future development and employment, but that impact would not reduce the availability of developable lands below the 20-year supply. It was also determined that a reduction in the tree preservation threshold to 20 inches would result in a small but not significant increase in housing costs at 0.11% overall, and 54 fewer housing units produced over the next 20 years. For some information about tree canopy and tree canopy distribution in Portland that highlights the needs to increase canopy in certain areas. Citywide canopy is 30.1%, but it's not distributed equitably. West Side canopy is at 56%, while East Side is at 21%. Current distribution is uneven and linked to income. Affluent and West Side neighborhoods have significantly more tree canopy, while East Side and lower income neighborhoods have less. Communities of color, low income refugee and immigrant communities are also generally located in areas characterized by lower amounts of tree canopy. But also note that areas with steep slopes or that are protected through other means, such as environmental zoning, also contribute to higher canopy levels. Here, in comparison to the previous slide, we can see that populations of color are more likely to reside in low canopy neighborhoods, and particularly in North and Northeast Portland, neighborhoods with a higher percentage of communities of color are adjacent to industrial zones. Note that this data is represented on the neighborhood level, but Portland's industrial zones do not allow housing, though housing may be adjacent to industrial zones. Providing adequate land supply for employment, and in particular industrial employment, is important. The preservation of adequate industrial capacity ensures the availability of middle wage jobs. Workers of color are underrepresented in the region's high wage occupations and overrepresented in the low wage occupations. Given this, the region's wage polarized growth trends disproportionately impact workers of color and contributes to racial income disparities. Among middle and high wage occupations, industrial jobs stand out as the only major occupation group in the Portland region that is occupied by proportionately more workers of color than workers that are white alone. Middle wage industrial occupations are also unique in that they can result in higher paying jobs over time by offering higher starting wages, more benefits, and job ladder careers relative to low wage occupations. Given the demographics of these workers, these benefits can be an important stepping stone for communities of color. Certainly, a more equitable future provides access to all job types and wage classifications, and ensuring availability of middle wage jobs is just one piece of an overall strategy to address the effects of systemic racism. Using data collected from the tree canopy analysis, coupled with the outcomes of the 2016 amendment that established that current preservation threshold at 36 inches, we made some simple projections for future tree preservation and mitigation fees. The 2016 amendment did have success decreasing the number of 36-inch trees removed by 64%. And that percentage increase and the overall rate of preservation is reflected here. However, there are several reasons why these projections might not be accurate. There are more 20 to 36 inch trees than there are 36 or greater inch trees, increasing the likelihood that they may be impacted by development and increasing the likelihood that they may not be preserved. On the other hand, smaller trees have smaller root protection zones, which may make it easier to accommodate a root protection zone and development. For the rate of preservation in IG1 and IH zones, it in reality could be lower due to other existing exemptions. However, other site variables could contribute to it being higher, including, especially on large sites, the location of trees and groves or in parking areas where they are less likely to be impacted by buildings. So overall, we can say with confidence that the rate of preservation and the amount of fees in lieu of preservation or planting will increase, but it's difficult to quantify to what level. On to community engagement, we had a community engagement plan with three main components. We interviewed 27 individuals representing a variety of organizations and interests in March. Themes emerging from there was that the tree code is too complicated. There's a desire for equitable outcomes in tree canopy distribution. There's a lack of clarity on how the tree planting and preservation fund is spent, and a concern with how the tree code interfaces with other city plans and policies, such as housing affordability, infill development, and other sustainability initiatives. In April and May, we held a survey to just gauge general priorities and values where we had more than 2,000 respondents. Nearly all respondents expressed support for preserving and planting more trees in industrial and commercial areas, particularly where they were near environmentally sensitive areas. Most surveyed also support using mitigation fees to improve environmental and health outcomes. Fewer respondents cited economic development and reducing the cost of regulation. though many noted that these are not priorities that are mutually exclusive with also increasing tree canopy. I want to note that respondents to this survey were heavily weighted toward self-identifying as having an interest in environmental advocacy. Finally, when we published the draft proposal, after that we held an online forum to review that proposal with a survey on the draft proposal. Survey respondents were almost 85% to 15% in favor of removing the exemptions in IG1, EX, and CX and reducing the size threshold to 20 inches, and almost exactly flipped for retaining the exemptions in IH. We also had a letter from a business coalition of the Home Builders Association, the Portland Business Alliance, the Building Owners and Managers Association, and the Columbia Corridor Association. And they had concerns about the overall increases in cost of development, and then concern about the cost of mitigation of trees when they're required to be removed due to other city requirements. However, most of these cases cited had to do with situations in the public right-of-way or situations that involved a land division, which is regulated by Title 33, neither of which is in the scope of this project. Audubon and the majority of other community members that provided comments expressed appreciation for the work that's been done and disappointment and frustration with retaining the exemptions in IH. So the staff proposal itself is to remove the tree preservation and tree density exemptions in General Industrial 1, Central Commercial, and Central Employment Zones, retain the tree preservation and tree density exemptions in the Heavy Industrial Zone, reduce that tree preservation threshold from 36 to 20 inches in diameter in all areas where preservation is required. And we also want to note that there's future work to be done to address tree canopy in IH zones. So the future opportunities for addressing IH zone are at this point twofold. We recognize the importance of tree preservation to mitigate climate change while protecting our most vulnerable communities and providing economic growth and job opportunity. And future work must work towards a solution that meets both of these goals. Reevaluation of the exemptions in particular, or identifying other ways to increase canopy in IH could occur, as I said, in one of two projects. The update to the economic opportunities analysis undertaken by BPS, and a potential future broader tree code project led by Parks Urban Forestry. So BPS's work on the update to the EOA has begun, and this usually takes about 2 years. The EOA update will incorporate a number of new environmental considerations, including updated BES wetland inventories and environmental overlay zone map corrections. It could also incorporate new tree requirements on IH zone. And then again, as specified in the council resolution, urban forestry is tasked with developing scope of work for a broader update of the tree code and is in the early phases of that now. This project is not currently specifically funded, however, and your advocacy at the city council level is appropriate. Any proposed changes through IH zone could be coordinated and incorporated into the new EOA done by BPS. So finally, next steps, we briefed the Urban Forestry Commission last Thursday. You have a joint hearing with Urban Forestry Commission on September 8th. Following that, each commission has separate work sessions and recommendations on September 17th and September 22nd. Yours is on September 22nd. Earlier, the PSC officers indicated a desire to have some joint discussion after testimony on the 8th, and also to have 1 to 2 members of each commission liaise with each other after the hearing to coordinate any amendments that you might have or highlight discussion points, and also attend each other's work sessions as a resource. And we do have volunteers from the Urban Forestry Commission to do that. And then finally, Portland City Council is scheduled right now for October 29th. So that's it, Eli.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thanks so much for all the work on this. And we know this was prompted in some part because of an amendment that we proposed when the last tree code update came. So now we see all the work involved to follow through on that.
Yes, and sorry, I'm going to figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Something I should have done while you're figuring that in the beginning is see if there's any conflicts of interest commissioners would like to share. Are there any? You can just jump out there and say it. Okay.
This
Yes.
is not necessarily a conflict of interest, but just in the interest of transparency. In my capacity at Verde, I was interviewed in that initial round, but I don't think we participated in the survey and we didn't provide draft comments. But just for the record, noting that I was in this process.
Thank you. Anyone else like to share?
I'll note that Jeff Bachrock was interviewed in that as well.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to go to some hands being raised. So Mike first and then Chris.
Well, this is going to come up again and again. In fact, it was referenced the E-zone update, and then I assume the floodplains and wetland inventories. Goal 9 is going to raise its ugly head in every instance, as it has here. And in the past, I know I have and others have asked staff if they have contemplated going to the state and asking for an exemption of Goal 9. We only have so much land. And unless we plan on moving on to Sauvie Island or some other area, they're not making any more land. And it's the tail wagging the dog. And so this is not well, it is a question actually. Has staff actually discussed going to the state and requesting an exemption for dealing, for example, in this case, climate change is a huge issue which we need to address. And, it's a huge equity issue as well with regard to, we see the distribution of urban forest canopy and where the trees are not. So that's my overarching question. I would like to say, I've read the whole report. I'm really impressed with the amount of work staff did. I have my own personal opinions about whether the correct analysis was done for IH land, and we can talk about that more later. But right now, it's the Goal 9 issue is the big one for me.
Does staff have any thoughts on that one? Or take it back later if you like.
I'll just note that, that specific question was raised with the Urban Forestry Commission as well. For this particular project, no, we haven't requested an exemption. For the larger question, though, I guess I would like to defer to BPS to offer any additional thoughts.
I'm going to jump in here for a moment. If BPS wants to chime in, they're welcome to, but Emily's giving us a briefing this meeting. Right before we take public testimony at our next meeting, BPS staff will be able to share additional perspectives from that bureau. Is that correct? I think that's what I've heard. So,
yeah, in the interest of time, I have other questions, but I think I'll put them in writing because I'm still kind of processing some of the really technical work that's been done by staff, which I think, again, is really excellent, but I've got some significant questions. Thank you.
Andrea?
Yeah, I was just say that would be helpful, Mike, and any other kind of questions that you want to have answered. We'll have some time at the next meeting before the hearing to have BPS staff kind of provide a little bit more context information.
Okay, thanks. Chris?
I think Joe wanted to say something.
Oh.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm not clued into the hand raise yet, but just in response to Mike's question, we have all had our eye on that issue for a while now about Goal 9 resources and the continued long-range viability of the approach we've taken to protect that industrial land and still meet objectives that we put in our comp plan, like providing for job growth, yes, but also providing for opportunities for households of color to get those jobs, to make sure that we've got the right resources for those jobs, given how the economy is changing in the future. We expect it to, or we would want it to. The place where we address that question, and for a lot of our industrial land, our heavy industrial land, we know that there's really important natural resources on that land. So the place for us to address that question, both on the land supply side and natural resource side, and on the economic plan side, is as part of the economic opportunity analysis and that piece of work that we have underway. That's the place where any request we would make to the state about how we're going to meet that objective differently or not meet that objective, we would make it. So it's not a disagreement that question Mike's identified is out there. It's we're working our way towards being able to have that discussion with the state and succeed. And also, we need to make choices in this next round. They're about policy choices to do things differently, to still satisfy the intent of the economic development goal of the state planning goals, but not get caught in this bottleneck or this dilemma with our need to also protect natural resources.
Okay. Chris.
Yeah, I want to zoom out to the big picture for a minute. So Emily, you quoted a tree canopy number, I think a little bit over 30%. How are we tracking on progress on our overall canopy goals since we adopted these regulations initially?
I am going to refer to urban forestry, either Brian Lando or Nick Desai, to answer that question, since they're the ones that are monitoring that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So we update our canopy analytics every 5 years. The current 30.1% coverage comes from 2015 information that we analyzed, I want to say in 2016. So it would be about another year or two till we would have an update on that, which is important because that update would capture a lot of the development activity that we've seen.
Okay, of course, while the citywide number is important, I think the question in front of us is largely an equity question about how it's distributed. So they're connected, but not determinative. Thank you.
Okay, Oriana, and after Oriana will be Jeff.
So I have a comment on the economic analysis side, and then also a question about the IH zoning. And I'll start with the comment and then lead into the question. And I think that first piece is just noting that industrial jobs are good middle wage jobs and tend to employ more Black, Indigenous, or other communities of color. I actually have a little bit of concerns about that assertion, which is namely it's not taking into account the health impacts of those jobs. And something I would posit is that there are more BIPOC folks in those jobs because they have those health impacts and are less appealing to white folks. So I think just making sure that when we're doing economic analysis work, we're also thinking about other intersecting factors as well, and not just valuing middle income jobs broadly, but understanding that there are still differences in terms of the impact on somebody's quality of life. So then the question on the IH side is, and this may be setting up BPS to do a little bit of work or BDS to do a little bit more work, but would be interested to understand that reasoning a little bit more. And I'm sure you can provide some of that in this moment, but would like to see just a sense of what the canopy looks like in the IH zones, and then what proximity they are to BIPOC communities, like superimposed on the same map, I think would help me in my thinking about that aspect of the package, what the impact is there, and then what the risks may be in kind of kicking this to another project. Because oftentimes for BIPOC communities, you can get a little bit of a win, or you can almost get a win, and then somebody says sometimes in the future, and that can lead to things never happening. So we have an opportunity to do this work now, and understanding the politics of the moment and other factors that are in play. I think from the community perspective, there is some sense of urgency from the health impacts that can come up here. And then also, just to close, I want to give a lot of gratitude for the folks who worked on this project. It in part comes out of an amendment that came from me. So sorry for putting that work on you, but also really grateful just having been engaged in the community engagement work, that I think it was strong work that was done to really thoughtfully work through this. And I think what's on the table is for the most part really excellent. So thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you for the amendment. I think it was needed. Let's go to Jeff, and then I'm going to jump in with a couple questions in the line.
I'll be brief. One, I applaud staff. I think they were given clear direction and they did a voluminous amount of work and analysis, and I support what they're proposing. I think at this point it's the logical thing to do in light of direction from City Council and the evidence. I mean, the evidence shows an awfully big hit to jobs in the IH zone. I was quite surprised by that, but I can see why staff made the recommendation they're making with the analysis that Johnson Economics provided. It'd be hard to ignore that. I did want to draw the commission's attention to one of the many documents in this package, and that was the community interview process, and they drew some pretty stark conclusions. And I'm just going to cite four of them real quickly. One is, and this is quoting, there is widespread agreement that the current tree code is not working well. Okay. Number two, Portland's tree code conflicts with other city codes and policies. Number three, the tree code fails to clarify what we want to protect. And four, stakeholders are left guessing about how mitigation funds are used. This is a 5-year-old program of regulations, and it's often managed by an urban tree commission that I don't know has the staff and expertise to really handle the complexity of the regulations they've been given. And so I think as we go forward, it's important to keep in mind, even if your perspective is more like Mike's than mine, about the importance of figuring out how to increase our tree canopy and how to effectively protect trees and plant more trees. We're obviously not doing a very good job of that. And so simply having regulations without working through their efficiency, without being clear on their outcomes, it's not a good way to go forward. It doesn't serve the trees, the benefits of trees, and it certainly doesn't serve the community well to have a set of regulations that everyone says just isn't working very well. And one piece of that I hope we can one day correct is we regulate trees in 2 different code sections, Title 11, Title 33, and that's just a cumbersome, problematic way to handle business. So I wish at one point we could merge those in one place. And then my last comment goes all the way back to Title IX and Mike's suggestion that we go to the state and ask for some sort of an exemption. That's a pretty big policy leap to make. And I think before we take it on and advocate for it, it'd be the city of Portland telling the state of Oregon, economic development is no longer a priority in Portland. We don't want to be bound by state requirements for economic development. Now, Mike, I know you're shaking your head, but that's how it would look. That would be sort of the political takeaway. And I think before we take that step, we ought to be really clear that is Title IX really the problem, or is there some more creative solutions we can come up with at a local level before we ask for a bailout from the state? I just hope, right now, I wouldn't support something that says, dear state, exempt Portland from Goal 9.
Thanks, Jeff. So I've had a couple comments and questions, I guess. One is that I think a positive thing of this code update is that developers will actually survey their sites before they design them, because they'll need to know what trees are already on the site. I've seen too many times builders, I'm one of them, who just don't even know what's there and they design the whole site and then it's too late to change anything to protect existing trees. One of the questions I have is about people trying to game the system. So I'd like, and this could be followed up afterwards, is what is the process to take down a 19-inch tree not in a development situation? So someone might groom a project for development at sale and clean the site, or maybe a 24-inch tree that's larger. And all the other question relates to just understanding how arborists works, because they have a lot of power in this scenario. 1 inch is $450. It can be thousands of dollars based on arborist determinations on tree diameter. And if a tree is healthy or unhealthy, that can have tens of thousands of dollars of impact. So I've known with wetland delineation, there have been known to be wetland delineators who write the lines where you want to put them there, because that can have enormous consequence on development. So I don't understand. I've hired arborists, but I don't actually know how the certification works to make sure that they're have some consistency. Another question I have is, if, which doesn't really make sense, intuitive sense to me, is that in the IH zones, it seems that the tree density requirement is at least as problematic in terms of the residual land value as the tree removal fee would be. And I don't quite understand why that's the case, because it seems logically that I can understand why if you have a whole wooded lot and you need to take out a certain bunch of trees to put your building there, that would force you to pay a big fee. But then the tree density requirement is largely made by just planting a whole bunch of trees. Why would that cause such a negative impact to the builder? Why couldn't they do that no matter where they are? And I had one other question, which is that in terms of the housing side, which is my background, I understand the effect on average housing prices is minuscule. However, I've also been presented with a bunch of lots, not a bunch, half a dozen, maybe a dozen, where people maybe are approaching me, maybe I'm not having a representative sample because people maybe talk to me about lots that have trees because I tend to preserve them. But there are lots out there where they're zoned for multifamily and they're just covered with trees, large trees, like 2-foot diameter trees or more. And some of those lots, if you take out a third of them, if you preserve a third of them and you take out many of the others, which you need to do to fit any buildings on the site, you're paying probably a pretty huge cost. So as an individual site level, it could be pretty dramatic, the impact of those fees. So I don't know if you ran into any of those sites in your analysis, but that's a follow-up question I have. So do you want to hit any of those now, Emily, or do you want to do them offline? I'll let you take the lead on that.
I will tackle a couple of them partially, but I may ask Steve Kuntz to chime in and help verify what I'm saying. So correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but the 0.11% total construction cost, I think, is the impact on overall new construction in the city over 20 years. And I actually did have a statement in there. I was eliminated for brevity about what you just said, that there will be a wide variety of impacts on individual sites. And so the cost impact really looks at it at a macro total level where, you may have a site that has significant costs, and then that's captured in the 54 less units that would be produced because it would be cost prohibitive to actually develop the site. As far as the tree density in IH zones, because for consistency's sake and just because of the difficulty of projecting choices, we did assume, as I mentioned, that the fees in lieu would be paid rather than the trees actually be planted. So, and that's the same for tree preservation. And particularly in less dense industrial areas, you may have development where the building actually really doesn't occupy a lot of space. And
that's why I figured there'd be room to plant a bunch of trees.
Right. And parking area trees can contribute to those tree requirements as well. But then the other thing, which I'm less knowledgeable about, is, and Steve can explain more now or later, that because those areas are employment, they're not employment dense, the land value, there's a really thin margin for increased cost and then how it would affect projected development. So Steve, I don't know if you have anything to add to that or clarify.
Thanks, Emily. This is Steve Kuntz. I think I'm unmuted. Steve Kuntz at BPS. On your second question, Eli, on why are the IH impacts so high on from the tree density requirements? Emily answered the general question. There were very uneven impacts overall in the analysis. The commercial zones and the residential zones overall, in the geographies that we looked at, we expected, or Johnson Economics predicted, impacts of less than 1% on the amount of buildable land inventory that is expected to be developed, but much higher in, it was like 34% of the BLI would be impacted and no longer pencil out in the IH land and in the other lands in the harbor and airport districts, which are mostly IG2, 17% impact on capacity. Part of it is because of the trees that are there and preservation requirements. Most of the vacant land in that area are portions of sites and portions of sites that have trees on them. And so there's more of a tree impact. And also all of the exempt zones right now don't have landscape requirements, landscape proportion requirements, like other zones do. So they allow full build out on the site. In the industrial zones, yes, the building density is only a small part of it, but most of the development in industrial zones are just outdoor use areas, truck maneuvering area, terminal space, a lot of high equipment that is vertical equipment. There are no height requirements in the industrial zones. And so the combination of flexibility for moving things around on those sites and et cetera results in a bigger impact. So industrial sites tend to be big, wide open areas of outdoor use and large one-story buildings.
Okay, thank you. I'll follow up on this later. My sense is the industrial sites have a lot of grass too.
Hey, I was going to just follow up too.
Oh, sure.
One of the things to consider is that when we're talking about the tree preservation, you're talking only existing canopy. When you're talking about the tree planting, the tree density requirement, you are bringing in a whole, the denominator is much larger, right? Because we're talking about both planting for both the vacant and the redevelopable sites, the ones that we've identified that are essentially underutilized. And so that would mean that you may have comparatively a smaller impact, but the fact that you have more land that would be now subject to those requirements that's why you get a similar impact.
Thank you. That helps. Yep. I'm going to go to Steph, and then I'll go to people's second questions. So Steph next, and then I'll go back to Mike, Jeff, and Oriana.
Thank you. And thank you for asking one of my questions about the fee in lieu versus replanting. You mentioned, Emily, related the stakeholders that included HBA, PBA, and Columbia Corridor, and discussed like middle wage jobs. And were there any union representation in stakeholders and or employee groups within the IH area? For I think particularly like Columbia Corridor, which is well represented in unions. And could you disaggregate some of those comments? Thank you.
That is a great question. No. So the stakeholder interviews we had like 27 individuals and 25 organizations represented. And we tried to capture industrial groups, environmental groups, neighborhood geographic groups, other identity groups, and a broad cross-section of that. But no, as far as the industrial areas, I'm trying to think back. I think that was represented just by the industrial associations. So I'm thinking like the Working Waterfront Coalition and the Columbia Corridor Association. So that is a great question. And no, we did not do that.
Thank you. Great stuff. Oriana and then Mike. Oriana.
I think Mike was ahead of me, so I'll defer to him first.
Okay, great. Yeah, it switched around on my screen. I thought so too. Mike.
Actually, I'm going to stick with my earlier promise to submit. I just forgot to take my hand down. I'll send questions in writing.
It's like a wiffle ball tournament here. Thanks. Yeah. Oriana, back to you.
Yeah, I actually wanted to make another mapping request, and this one I think will be a little bit easier, and perhaps for BPS when they come. But I think it'd be really valuable to see the heat island map that either that's been produced by Vivek Chandas, or I know there's been some internal work done as well. But just what Steve was talking about in terms of the nature of these IH sites, a lot of them have a really big heat island impact because they're low to the ground. There's a lot of asphalt. There may be a lot of grass as well, but that still doesn't mitigate the heat island effect as much as trees. So I think as we have the conversations around the fee in lieu versus planting trees and what impact our industrial lands have on communities, I think it'd be valuable to just keep that in mind as well.
Thank you. I've got one more question for me, which is a little bit detailed. On the industrial occupations graph that you shared, showing that people who participate in those, in that type of work are heavily communities of color, at least compared to other sections of the workforce. Could you get construction onto that graph? Because I think that was somewhere else in the report, but I think my sense is that construction workers are also at least as diverse as the industrial occupations listed. So maybe just adding that to the table would be helpful for me.
Steve Kuntz, on that, I can quickly reply. Yeah, construction is included in the industrial occupations. It includes—
Oh, it's part of that category.
Production, transportation, construction, and another one, maintenance and installation.
Okay, then I guess that would be helpful to disaggregate that, because construction happens all over the city versus, so could you please disaggregate that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hey, Eli, I had one more question just to follow up on your first question. When you were talking about the loopholes, can you describe what you're looking— I mean, unless you want to do it more certainly in writing, but I guess I'm just sort of wondering, you brought in non-development situation versus development situation. So if you could maybe give a little bit more
context. I grew up in Washington, D.C. While I lived there, they adopted a tree code, and it was pretty common for people to cut down trees that were getting close to the diameter where the tree code would regulate. And I know that's always a dynamic with these regulations, so I'm not saying it's a problem with regulation, but if someone's going to be getting a situation where they're selling a property, they're not doing development, and they know that any developer is going to take down such and such trees in the yard, are going to be faced with thousands of dollars of fees, the seller of the property might preemptively remove those trees if their cost of doing so is less. So I wonder, that's the piece. So it's basically taking trees down, not in development situations. And I guess the 19 inch is the one threshold for it, but it could be a higher number also. And so understanding that dynamic would help maybe anticipate consequences of this. Oriana? Or yeah, Emily, do you want to just jump in?
Well, I'll just hop in. The rules for removing, the circumstances under which you can remove a tree in non-development situations there's a much higher threshold to get approval for removal of a tree when when it's not associated with development. And we can explain that more in a response to you from urban forestry, but that helps mitigate that concern of somebody just going in and removing a bunch of trees and then not being subject to the regulations when they come in to develop the site, because it's really difficult to get approval to remove a healthy tree absent development.
Okay, it'll be good to get that summary. Yeah. Brian, do you want to jump in? I'm seeing your name up. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the heat island comment real quickly. So it's a great point. Our report does include actually the map that Vivek's research put together that I believe shows about a 15 or 18% temperature increase in those zones. Just because the way that the impervious surfaces hold heat throughout the day and then release it in the afternoon and the evening. So that's a great comment, though. We should probably add that to the presentation itself.
And Vivek, the chair of the UFC, would be able to share that with you very quickly. Oriana.
Yeah, Eli, something you said, and sorry that my dog is barking in the background, but just wanted to add to that. I think if we're disaggregating, it would be helpful also in the economic analysis to know who is actually owning the businesses that are doing this work. I think we don't always disaggregate well between workers and actual ownership of businesses or companies and the opportunity to build wealth and power for communities in that way. And sorry to be troubling the economic analysis so much, but I think there are a lot of problems with how it is typically done and how we determine what the impact of an industry or a business is on a community without also thinking about what the impacts are from a more burden perspective. It's not just creating jobs, but there are more holistic factors that need to be considered.
Okay, are there additional questions or comments? Okay, well, we've given a little bit of things to start working on, and I know that BPS will be presenting to us in 2 weeks. For those in the public who'd like to comment on this code update, will be 2 weeks from now at 12:30 start time, but we'll probably start public comment a little after that, so we have time for a BPS presentation. Those details are still being figured out. And so that's September 8th for a joint hearing. The Urban Forestry Commission will be joining us at that time. And I think that is, any final questions?
Eli, can I offer clarification? The September 8th hearing, your regular meeting time starts at 12:30. We've moved it to start at 2 p.m.
Thank you.
Primarily there's a significant youth interest and, the time, not knowing, we still kind of don't know what youth's availability related to school is going to be. But the meeting starts at 2, and then I believe this agenda item is about at 3:30.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate making that adjustment to get participation. So with that, our meeting is adjourned, and I'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone.